We are recording. Sweet. Thanks for being here at our workshop. Conflict is not a problem. I'm Zach, and my company is Heart Talks, where I help people busy being successful make communication less stressful. We're all about cutting through the noise out there on the internet and connecting with what really needs to be communicated. So, I appreciate you guys tuning in and thanking you in advance for your engagement and participation. We're going to talk about what I even mean by conflict, what it is, where it comes from, and why we tend to think of it as a problem. And we'll also talk about why treating it like a problem creates problems. We'll go into some detail about what those problems can be. And then, of course, we'll talk about how to avoid that, how to reframe conflict, not as this problem to be solved or problem to be avoided, which is most common, but reframing conflict as an opportunity to connect. We'll talk about how that changes the conversation entirely and how that's actually pretty crucial for human relationships and connections. It changes the conversation, and the conversation becomes very unfamiliar for most of us. Not a lot of us were given tools for navigating conflict in a healthy way, let alone communicating at baseline in all that healthy of a way, if you're anything like me. But I've developed a very real, very implementable game plan for how to get there so that our conflicts and our hard conversations are generative and we can stay connected, and so that these conversations suck less. And there will be plenty of time at the end for us to go through an exercise together that is kind of the crucial part, the crux of that game plan for approaching conflict not as a problem, but an opportunity to connect. And then we'll just kind of connect about how that experience went for us and talk about it and go from there. So I'll lay some foundation first. I won't talk too much. There will be plenty of opportunities for us to contribute. I'll ask you guys to put things into the chat or speak up if you feel comfortable. Speaking of which, we've got Hani joining us right now. There he is. Hani, thanks for popping in.
What's up?
We are already recording. Just want to make sure you're cool with that. Sweet. You can have your camera on or off, whatever makes you more comfortable. I was just running through what the workshop's all about, how we're going to talk about what conflict is, why it's not actually a problem, why treating it like a problem can be a problem, and give us some actual tools and a real game plan for moving through it, so that we can stay connected. So you came in right at the beginning of laying our sort of conceptual foundation, talking about what conflict even is, what it means, where it comes from. And most of us think of conflict as this like big, scary conversation that blows up in everyone's faces. Maybe it gets kind of loud, and it can be super problematic when it's loud and aggressive and unhealthy like that. But what's really going on there is what's really going on in conflict is that people's wants and needs are misaligned. They're coming into contact. That's all that it takes for conflict to happen. So when I'm talking about conflict, I'm talking about any time that happens. So even like minor disagreements about what to eat for dinner. That's one of my favorite examples. I'll refer to it again a couple more times. Not just these big, tense arguments that we tend to call conflict and we think of as a problem, but I'll be using more of these like mundane scenarios to show how common the issue is of not knowing how to navigate misaligned wants and needs, and to show how surprising, how like surprisingly common conflict actually is. It also helps to like normalize it and treat it less like a problem. So again, conflict happens anytime people's different wants, needs, ideas come into contact, right? And when that happens, it's uncomfortable. That discomfort that we experience is actually why we think of it as a problem. We'll dive a little bit more into that, but I want to get some more examples out there of these like daily sort of mundane, often overlooked frustrations and discomfort that comes from differing wants and needs. The dinner example is my favorite one because we have to have that conversation every day. So that's maybe a daily conflict, a little mini conflict that we have. But if you guys have any other ideas, pop into the chat or go ahead and speak up if you feel comfortable. Just these daily things, situations we find ourselves in super frequently where differing wants, needs, preferences come into contact and causes a little bit of discomfort. So I'll put dinner decisions in here just to break the ice. Like I want pizza, you want sushi. Now we're in conflict. We're not arguing, but we're in conflict. I want something different than what you want. Okay, cool. I see who cleans and when. Yeah, anytime we have lived with another person, this is a very frequent conversation that has to be had. That's a conversation that seems pretty straightforward, but a lot of us avoid it. It can make us fairly uncomfortable. We'll come back to this as well in the next little phase of participation here. Good. Okay. So yeah, anytime decisions are being made, like planning for a day out, what activities, which movie to watch, right? I want to watch Godzilla v Kong, and you want to watch A Quiet Place. Now we're in conflict, right? I want to have a picnic at the park, and you really, really want to go see A Quiet Place. These are very different things, and they're revealing to us what, or they can reveal to us what I actually want and need, and why that's coming into conflict, as long as we can sit with it for long enough. And that's where we're going with this. Who gets the last cookie? Classic struggle that most of us face on a pretty frequent basis. Yeah, I mean, I want the last cookie, you want the last cookie. Splitting it in half is completely unreasonable. So we have to settle this dispute in some way or another, right? And that can make us really uncomfortable. I appreciate the ideas there. I appreciate the contributions. And these things cause a surprising amount of tension and friction, right? They're very small decisions and very common conversations that we have, just planning an activity, choosing what movie to watch, who gets the last cookie. These are things that we don't think of as causing discomfort, but because our differing wants and needs are in conflict, it is actually causing some discomfort. This stuff is uncomfortable. We have to acknowledge that elephant in the room before we can proceed in a healthy way. Because if we can't handle that discomfort, then we start treating it like a problem to be solved right away or to avoid it. We'll talk about some ways that that happens, but I want to first normalize the discomfort of deciding who gets the last cookie or making a day plan, right? Of course, this stuff is uncomfortable. We have evolved to be communicative, collaborative creatures. We value harmony because our ancestors would have died without it. A lot of them probably did because of disharmony, right? So conflict can very easily cause this discomfort And it can kind of fly under the radar in these mundane, everyday situations. The conflict about where to go for the day or what movie to watch can actually cause a very varied range of responses. Anything from like mild frustration about this decision shouldn't be so hard, or like, why can't we just watch Godzilla v Kong, all the way to a very serious nervous system response, what a lot of people refer to as fight, flight, or freeze, like a stress response in your nervous system, depending on various factors, your nervous system, the decision being made. So even something as simple as what to watch can cause that full range of experiences for us when we are confronted with that discomfort. And this is not a problem. That response itself in our nervous system and the discomfort itself, those are not problems. Treating it like a problem can be, and we're going to get into how. And I'm going to keep repeating it for over an hour because it's so sneaky, and we don't tend to think of that as the problem. We just think, oh, conflict, discomfort, problem, and we avoid it or rush through it. So I want to linger here on some other pretty common situations that we tend to find ourselves in that cause this nervous system response, this discomfort that we're going to learn to work with more effectively and more healthily. So on the scale of 1 to 10, 1 being that mild frustration, like, ugh, Godzilla v Kong, ugh, and 10 being fight, flight, or freeze, this pretty intense nervous system response where I'm fighting, I might get loud, might get snappy, might have all the comebacks, might be interrupting you. That's the fight part. Flight being I'm shutting down to disconnect, or I'm maybe literally leaving the room because I just can't. Or I'm freezing, where I'm just stuck, don't know what to say because my nervous system is freaking out. That's 10 on our discomfort scale. So 1, mild frustration, ugh. 10, fight, flight, or freeze. I'm going to give us some common scenarios, and I want you guys to throw in the chat where on that scale your nervous system responds, what it's like for you to put yourself in this situation, just to see where we're at and see how different all of us respond to these things. So the first scenario, pretty common one, you are going on vacation for 4 or 5 days. You have to decide how to take care of your pets. Who's going to do it? How often? What their responsibilities will be. This is a conversation you have to have with whoever you live with, or simply a decision you have to make. Maybe it's the conversation you're having with the people that you are asking to take care of your pets. So put yourself in that situation. In the chat, let me know 1 to 10 how uncomfortable this makes us deciding on pet care while on vacation. Okay, good. Okay, I see a range here from 2 to 4. Yeah, 2s, 3s, 4s. This is interesting. And it doesn't seem like a huge range, 2 to 4, right? But that's significant because 2 is like, it's uncomfortable. I don't really want to be having this conversation, but it's got to be done. And 4 is like, I'm maybe starting to get a little anxious now. Those of us who put down a 4, any thoughts or feelings that informed that number for you in the chat or out loud if you're comfortable?
I think for me, it's like, nothing bad is gonna happen to your pet, but then there's always like that irrational fear that, like, what if like the door was left open and the cat ends up in the back?
Right.
Not saying that's never happened to me,
Things can happen though. You're right. And there's always the possibility of it. And I see in the chat too, very similar sentiment, getting anxious about making sure nothing goes wrong. Yeah, what happens to the cats and in the house while you're gone is out of your control. So that can really induce some anxiety, some worry. Hani said fear. Yeah. So these feelings are an important piece of the puzzle that are informing the conflict. And we'll dig into that a little bit deeper as we go along as well. Thank you guys for sharing. Situation number 2. This was alluded to already, but I'm going to get a tiny bit more specific about it. Scenario number 2 is doing the dishes. Who does them and when? How often? Where are we on the discomfort scale? 1 to 10. Okay, see some 2s, some 3s, some 3.5s. For me, it's a 3 to 5. There's a range for me, and I'll get into that too. Yeah, so this one, some variance here too, maybe a little less. And it seems like there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's less at stake here. There's no cute, fuzzy animal depending on me. It's just a mess that needs to be cleaned up. Yeah. But even this, see, I mean, nobody said 1. All of us are at least a 2. Even this every day or every other day or every few days, however often you guys decide to do the dishes, even this conversation causes some discomfort for us. And for me, I said 3 to 5. I gave a range because it depends very strongly on who I'm having the conversation with. If I'm at home with my partner and the sink is full of dishes, it's like a 1 or a 2 on the scale because we've been living together for a while. We've established this pattern of communication, and either of us can ask the other to do things around the house without any weird stuff coming up. Now, where it gets to maybe a 5 on the scale is when I'm visiting my parents and they would like me to help do the dishes because they've been cooking for me the past 3 days. And instead of simply asking, hey, after dinner, could you do the dishes? Or could you empty the dishwasher for me? One of my parents might say, geez, when are you going to help out around here? If you're anything like me, you just cringed a little bit hearing that. So it depends a lot on who we're talking to and how they're responding and stuff. And because the other person's response will naturally activate stuff within us. It can make us cringe. It can activate some of the fear and anxiety that we talked about before, right? And that's part of what we're working with here, is getting to know our own experience in all of this so that we can work with that and figure out what to communicate. Because if my parents say, geez, when are you going to help out around here? And I respond with, I don't know, when you can't change your own diaper or something. Like now we're bordering on maybe getting a little toxic, right? So that's the kind of stuff we want to avoid. And I'll get us into one more scenario that's pretty common for us, and we can see where we're at on this 1 to 10 scale before we move on, just for fun and just to explore some more discomfort a little bit. It's very present on most of our minds, and it's going to be more and more present. There's going to be a lot more conversations about this in the coming months. The third scenario I want us to explore is conversations about the upcoming presidential election. We can get a little bit more spicy, a little bit more controversial, perhaps. Explore some of the discomfort around something that's swirling in our environments and in our minds these days. I see a 3 in the chat, 4 to 5 in the chat as well. 5, yeah, I'm at about a 5 as well. Thank you guys for that. Yeah, so here we've got a range of 3 to 5 in our varying responses. I'm curious, again, for those of us who are on the higher end, near the 5, what sort of thoughts and feelings informed that number?
When it comes to like political just conversations, I feel like in that sort of aspect, you can't really do anything about someone having a different view. Say a leftist is talking to a more conservative person. Yeah, you won't necessarily change their ideals, and I feel like it's just going to be more arguing and just like being more confused of why this person has these views, vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for digging into that a little bit, man. I think I hear you saying that there's some confusion, maybe even some helplessness kind of creeping in, like this person just thinks how they think, and there's nothing I can do about that. And I also hear a little bit of an assumption, not to put you on the spot. I think this is an assumption a lot of us have, especially when talking to someone who we know thinks a little bit differently than us. We have this assumption that we should be trying to change their mind, or that it would be a good thing if we could change their mind. And that's not a problem. I want to be clear about that. That's something that naturally comes up for us, and how we end up handling it can amplify the discomfort of of the situation. So I appreciate you sharing that, and there's just kind of built-in tension, where our more public discourse seems to be centered on making sure I get my point across and seeing where and how I might be able to change someone else's mind, when it could be centered on a mutual understanding that would still be pretty uncomfortable because we're disagreeing, but maybe a little bit lower on this scale. Thanks for sharing that, man. I see in the chat talking about politics with people at work / with strangers can be more dicey. I think we all agree on that. What comes up around that? I think there's some uncertainty in it, especially hearing somebody in line behind you at the grocery store make a political comment that might be kind of ambiguous. There's some uncertainty. Yeah, unsure of how they'll react. For sure. For sure. And we can only really be sure of how we might react. And sometimes that's not even certainty. So a lot of what we will get into in terms of how to navigate that discomfort is to get in touch with our own reactions. Since we can never be sure how someone else might react, we'll connect with how I'm reacting when I hear that person say something before I've even thought of a response. And this helps to move through that discomfort a little bit more. I see also in the chat, personally, not caring too much about politics, but being lectured about it by a hard supporter. This seems to be increasingly common out there in the world. And it can be one of those reactions that you get from someone that can increase the discomfort of the uncertainty. And nobody likes to be lectured. even people who are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to university and be lectured don't really like being lectured. They are doing it because they have to. And so I very much resonate with the discomfort of that. Can I get some hands or some thumbs up reactions for anyone who's vibing with this, who's had this kind of experience recently? Yeah, good. Thank you for sharing that. And part of what we can do by moving through the stuff we are moving through in this workshop is find ways of avoiding the tough spot of having to endure this lecture, and also making sure that we don't end up being the person doing the lecturing. So I appreciate you guys moving through that stuff with me, exploring some of that discomfort around these really common situations. So when we aren't able to handle the discomfort of these situations, as I've mentioned a few times already, that can become a problem, or it can create problems. And I want to get into that a little more deeply. So when we can't engage in a conflict, when we're avoiding it because the discomfort is too much for us, we miss out on so much of life. We don't get to have that conversation. We don't get to explore the underlying wants and needs that are misaligned, that are creating the conflict in the first place. Another way of putting it is that avoiding the discomfort of conflict robs us of everything that it's trying to tell us. It robs us of all of the juicy meat of this conflict, those wants and needs, right? And we need to be able to move through this together, because we need the human contact and the interaction. And me being a different person than you, we are naturally going to have these different wants and needs. So just to get our basic needs met of connecting with other people and belonging, we need to be able to move through this discomfort together. And in another sort of extreme way of putting it, just to really drive the point home, if we were to never engage in conflict and never sit with the discomfort of it, we would never really get to know each other and never really get to be known, because we would never get to examine the wants and needs underneath the discomfort. So that's kind of heavy. And I did see a couple of nods. I wonder how that's, I want to pause there, just let that sort of marinate, see how that's landing with us. See some more nodding. Yeah, we can kind of hang with that for a second. It sounds weird. It may even cause a little bit of discomfort just to hear that. That never engaging in conflict means never really knowing someone or never really being known, because we don't get to explore what's underneath the conflict. It sounds very strange, because we've all heard, you know, birds of a feather flock together and these sorts of things. We are conditioned to expect near perfect alignment with the people closest to us pretty much all the time. And when we're misaligned, we're like, oh, it's time for some space, or it's time for a change of plans. Let's just scrap it all together and do something else. Or in the extreme, it's time for some new friends. I think a lot of the isolation and disconnection that people out there in the world are feeling, some of us included on occasion, has to do with our inability to sit with the discomfort of misaligned wants and needs, and not letting ourselves lean into that together to understand my own wants and needs better and have a better chance of getting them met, and to hear and understand your wants and needs better. I think this expectation of perfect alignment and harmony all the time is frankly bullshit. I think that being close with someone, really loving each other, means wanting the best for each other and wanting to share these pieces of ourselves and our lives that are not always aligned. And I think what helps to make this point, or to really feel it, is to think of all the people closest to you, right? Best friends, siblings, they're all people likely that you have gone through some hard stuff with and come out on the other side feeling more connected. Yeah. Yeah. We build closeness and trust by moving through the experience of clashing wants and needs, by moving through discomfort together, right? This builds way more closeness and trust than finishing each other's sentences or knowing each other's orders at our favorite restaurant. Builds a lot more closeness and trust than rooting for the same people on Love Island. These things feel good and we can laugh about them, but there's not the depth in that. There isn't a really deep connection with each other's wants and needs involved in those interactions. So when we are treating conflict like a problem, we're problematizing the discomfort, right? But we're robbing ourselves of that deeper connection that the discomfort and moving through it together can bring. I like to think of it this way because the conflict itself isn't a problem. It's just uncomfortable. And I like to linger on it a little bit because the discomfort is really what we're avoiding and what we're trying to solve ASAP so that we don't have to experience that discomfort anymore. It's not as if we are avoiding our own wants and needs or trying to rush through the other person's wants and needs, right? Remember, that's what conflict is. We don't want to avoid or rush through each other's wants and needs underneath. We just haven't been taught to handle the discomfort. And so we find ways around it. I want to talk about some of the ways that we find to avoid, to circumvent, to push through the discomfort of conflict, how often they come up, and the problems that they can cause. We'll get through this very briefly, and then we'll move into our exercise together to explore some of the discomfort a little bit more deeply. So I'm going to list a few of these sort of clever avoidance mechanisms that I think are most common. And if you guys don't mind opening up a little bit in this space, I'll be the first one to raise my hand for some of these to indicate that I am guilty of doing these things. And I want to see how much these things resonate with us as well, how often they pop up in our lives. So raise a literal physical hand or a digital yellow emoji hand when this comes up. We'll talk about them in a little bit of detail as well, and some of the problems that they can cause. So the first, and what I think is the most common way that we avoid or push through the discomfort of conflict, is that we shapeshift and people please. I'm going to raise my hand immediately. This is something, I see some thumbs up. Yeah, this resonates with most of us, with all of us here at least. And it's, I feel like I need to have my other hand on a Bible when I'm doing this. I'm holding it there for so long. Side note, the shape-shifting and people-pleasing, I think it's the most common one, frankly. And it's so sneaky because we think we're doing the right thing. We're rushing to meet another person's wants and needs for them, right? This makes me a good friend. It solves the conflict. It resolves the discomfort of it so effectively, so quickly. This is what we think, right? Even though we know that it rarely works And this is for a couple of reasons, right? We're rushing to meet that person's wants and needs before we know what their wants and needs actually are. We haven't taken the time to sit with the discomfort yet to find out what their wants and needs actually are. And we're just rushing to try to make them feel better so that we can also feel better. And neither of us have to experience the discomfort anymore, right? And I will reiterate that this is not a problem. This compulsion to people please is not a problem. It's a very natural mechanism to try and resolve that discomfort. None of us want to feel the discomfort, right? It's a way of keeping myself safe from that discomfort and from the uncertainty of how this person might react. It also gives me a little bit of like emotional street cred, right? Makes me a good friend, good person, etc. It can, however, create the problem of rushing to meet that person's wants and needs, and those wants and needs are simply incorrect. We assumed incorrectly, and now we're trying to help, and we're just making stuff worse. Have we had that experience before? I've been there. It's we're all raising our hands. Yeah, I appreciate the openness there. Lots of thumbs up. Yeah. So we'll talk about how better ways of dealing with this. I want to get to the second most common way that we tend to avoid the discomfort of conflict. And it comes from a similar place, like a protective sort of mechanism, right? The second most common is to detach or distance or dissociate. We are psychologically walled off and maybe just kind of nodding along or not even paying attention. Maybe we're physically absenting ourselves from the room. This one's a little bit more obvious when we see someone else doing it to us, because it kind of sucks, right? But I see some hands going up. I have done this plenty in the past. It's something I'm doing a little less frequently. For me, it's usually that psychological kind of shutdown, like I'm in my own head, working out my own solution to this problem, or just kind of nodding along, hoping that it ends sometime soon. And so, as I mentioned, this is another protective mechanism. Just like people pleasing, I'm trying to keep myself safe from the experience of discomfort and from whatever energy is coming at me from the other person. Maybe they're kind of upset and I don't know how to handle that, so I'm gonna wall off, or just I can't handle it and leave the room. These first two, both of them are these protective mechanisms, and they both involve acting as if we don't have our own wants and needs or our own preferences at all. This is the big problem with people pleasing and with detaching/distancing, is that we're not honoring our own experience. We're suppressing and ignoring our own wants and needs. And we know we can all infer the problems that come along with that. I'm going to summarize all of the numerous problems that come from ignoring and suppressing our own experience by saying that if I am ignoring and suppressing my own wants and needs, other people will too. You gotta count your own chickens first, or however they say it, right? So when we are able to sit with this discomfort of conflict a little bit more, we can recognize some of our own wants and needs, and we don't have to ignore and suppress them by trying to rush to meet the other person's needs, or by detaching ourselves to try and stay safe. The third most common way that I think we tend to avoid the discomfort of conflict is trying to problem solve. We're treating conflict like a problem. We're gonna try to solve that problem. We're trying to logic our way into a solution right here, right now. to resolve that discomfort. I'm raising my hand. This is probably the one I'm most guilty of personally. I see numerous hands and thumbs up also coming through the screen. I appreciate the openness. This is a really common one. We live so much in our heads, and we think of ways to solve problems on a daily basis, and we use our brains and our logic very effectively. And so we try to apply that to this emotional discomfort that we're feeling as well. We want to find a win-win. That's what our logical brains are trying to do. So again, this one's also not a problem. The desire for a win-win is not a problem. The problem arises when we think the win-win is just getting rid of the discomfort. We can't arrive at a real win-win until we know what our wants and needs are that are causing the conflict, and what the other person's wants and needs are that are causing the conflict. Because then we can see which wants and needs are able to be met right now, and you'd be surprised how often those things are actually aligned. So we can, as long as we can sit with it long enough and talk about it, actually have that conversation, then we can get to a win-win. I saw a couple of hands. Are these are hands that are still up, just acknowledging that we problem solve, or are these questions? Okay, cool. I appreciate the vulnerability, guys. Acknowledging that we do some of these things and that it can cause problems is not easy. And I appreciate you guys sharing that with the group and with me. So when these things happen, at least one person's wants and needs go unfulfilled. We're rushing to meet the other person's, so ours are ignored or suppressed. We're detaching, so nobody gets to talk about their wants and needs. Or we're trying to problem solve, but the problem we're solving is the discomfort, not the actual conflict of the wants and needs. So those get cast aside as well. At least one person's wants and needs are unmet. And this, over time, increases the discomfort, increases the conflict. It can blow up. It can cause disconnection. It can cause resentment. It magnifies over time. So it's probably clear by now what I'm aiming at here. To get better at conflict and hard conversations, and therefore to get to deeper connections with the important people in our lives, we need to get better at handling the discomfort. So here's our game plan, and then we'll move into our exercise. First, we reframe it cognitively, like we've been doing here. I think we've already done a very good job of reframing conflict as this big problem to solve or avoid, and learning, teaching ourselves that it's an opportunity to connect based on the wants and needs that are coming into contact. And then our next step, which we're about to move into, is to retrain our nervous systems to be able to handle that discomfort, to be able to experience the discomfort and move through it together. And the way we begin to do that is by breathing. This might sound kind of silly because we're breathing all the time. We don't have to think about our breath. It just happens, thank God. And the people who know me well enough are also kind of shaking their heads because they're like, dude, this guy is so obsessed with breathing. I don't understand what that has to do with having better conversations, with dealing with discomfort. What's going on here? It's not a yoga class, bro. Like, get over it. I understand. Now, there's two reasons that we start with the breath. There's a practical answer and there's a physiological answer. I'll start with the practicality of it. A breath is a pause. Slows everything down, and it gives us a moment to figure out what the hell is going on. And this can literally make all the difference. Just that 1 to 2 second pause. I like to quote or paraphrase the psychiatrist and concentration camp survivor Viktor Frankl. He wrote his amazing book, Man's Search for Meaning. Highly recommend it. It's like 200 pages long. And he says that in between stimulus and response, there's a space to choose our response. In that space lies our growth and our freedom. So the practical answer to why we breathe in order to have better conversations is that taking a breath on purpose expands that space where that growth and freedom is. Now we have this space and we get to choose our response. Even more importantly, when we take control of our breath, it regulates our nervous system. That's the physiological function that it has. It does actually calm us down. When somebody tells you to take a deep breath after you want to punch them, and after you do take a deep breath, it does calm you down, as long as you're doing it intentionally. So I'm very tempted to geek out on the neuroscience of this and like recommend you guys all of the 16 hours of Huberman Lab podcasts that talk about breath and why it's good for you. I can summarize all that though by just saying that conscious control of our breath is one of the few ways that we have any control over our autonomic nervous system. That's the part of our nervous system that does all of this automatic stuff for us, like breathing and controlling heart rate and controlling that fight, flight, or freeze response, that stress response. So taking conscious control of the breath, even for a brief moment, regulates all of that. And these responses are what come up first and what can really quickly hijack us if we're not aware and able to breathe through it. And that's when some of these conversations can get a little ugly, right? So breathing pauses, gives us that space to choose our response, and it settles us into our bodies, into our nervous systems, so that the response we choose can be more intentional. So we're going to do some breathing together. We're going to keep exploring a little bit more discomfort, and we will move through it slowly. I will guide us, and I want us to be comfortable. Before we start breathing together on camera, I want to make sure we're comfy physically and emotionally. You can see me fidgeting already, so make any adjustments you need to make sure you're sitting comfortably. Your feet are ideally on the ground. They don't have to be. Your sweaty t-shirt is no longer sticking to you. And before we start, also, we're going to jot a couple of things down on paper or on a document in whatever device you're using, if that's more convenient for you. So have that handy, and I'll give us a moment to settle in before I start guiding us through some breath. So again, we want comfort here. So for the emotional comfort piece, close your eyes. You can keep them open if you like. I'll be kind of just looking over here into the corner of the room. You can turn away from the screen. You can turn your camera off, whatever makes you feel most comfortable. Once we're there, once we've gotten to a comfy spot, we're going to take a few deep breaths. Well, it's just one deep breath right now. Not forcing anything, slow and steady. Breathe as deeply as you can and just see how that feels. Nice and slow on the exhale. 2 more breaths. Our next inhale, notice your body. What's going on in there? Just experience that. How deep does the breath go? How much am I trying to force it? Slow and steady. Notice how comfy you are. Make any movements you want. It's all welcome here. One more breath. Good. On your last exhale, feel your feet on the ground or under you if you're sitting them. All right. We're going to stay with our breath, stay comfy, and we're going to bring to our minds, to our memory and our attention, the most recent conversation we had that was tense or uncomfortable. We're tuning into that experience in our minds for this practice. Keep breathing. It's something like a 3 to 5 on that discomfort scale, and it's recent enough that we can imagine it clearly. Keep breathing. Noticing whatever else comes up while we hold that in our minds. Our next inhale, let's breathe into those feelings in the body. Bringing our attention to sensations in the body. Maybe there's tension, maybe there's heaviness, some heat and sweat. Just breathe and notice. Tuning into the body experience, letting it be there. Good. Also notice any words coming to mind. Staying with the breath, noticing the confusion, anger, should, hurt, letting it be there. Breathing and noticing the bodies and words coming to mind. Slow and steady, not forcing anything. Good. Saying this stuff is really hard. So we're changing the flow. We're not rushing to say anything. Just breathing and noticing. Now, when you're ready, bring your breath back to a normal pace and get ready to write some things down. We're going to put 2 columns on that paper when you're ready. New last breath movement. I'm going to show you what I mean here. When we've set up 2 columns to record some of this experience. So we should all see this Google Doc here. We have the left column for those feelings in the body, the sensations like tension, like heaviness, fidgety. I'm feeling some buzzing and some sweating, for example. Go ahead and write those down, whatever came up. Staying with your breath as much as you can. Just letting it all be there. Don't need a long list. Really, if there's only one word that comes, that's fine too. When you're ready, look at that second column for those feeling words that may have come to mind, like nervous, like sad, frustrated, even helpless. Write those down. We're already doing a lot for ourselves just by making space for this experience. So this is going a long way toward moving through the discomfort. Good. When we're ready, we've got a word or 2 or 5 in each of those columns. Just going to read what we've written. Take a few breaths into that. Letting ourselves notice all of it. Letting it be there. If you want to hold those sensations and those words in your mind and your attention while you close your eyes again, you're welcome to do so. Just breathing into it. Take 3 breaths at our own pace, not forcing it, slow and steady. Now, when we're ready, we're going to tune into our minds a little bit. We're going to listen to what we are thinking around these feelings. When we read this list of sensations and feelings, our minds are trying to make sense of the experience. Thoughts come up about our feelings. Our mind tells us stories about what we are experiencing, usually trying to tell us why we're feeling what we're feeling. Something was wrong. We did something wrong. Something was unfair. We tell ourselves stories to try and make sense of what we're experiencing. This is where a lot of should comes up. This, like much of what we have talked about, is also not a problem. Our minds love stories. We need stories to make sense of reality and our own experiences. So we're just tuning in to these thoughts and stories about our feelings. And that's what is going to go in our third column here. So we have our thoughts about our feelings. Next to our feeling words, when we're ready, again at your own pace as you feel comfortable. Jotting down some of these thoughts and stories, these phrases like, I have to, I shouldn't have, they shouldn't have, I didn't know. Whatever your mind is telling you to try and make sense of your feeling experience. These things come up. And the goal is not to reject them, just to be with them. Take a moment, write that stuff down. Breathe into it. Listening to these stories influences our felt experience. So just breathe into that. Let it be there. Okay. Come back to your breath when you're ready. Finish writing whatever you need to write. We have plenty of time to work through this. A lot can come up. So write down whatever you need to, however much there is. When you're ready to come back, let me just get a thumbs up or something in the chat to let me know. No rush. Thank you. All right. Looks like we're all ready. So we're going to work with these thoughts, what I like to call these stories we tell ourselves. Look at your list there and notice which of these stories sticks the most. What stands out to you? Which one are you maybe repeating to yourself? Take a moment, read that, and notice. Ask yourself, does saying this to myself, does reading it feel worse? Does it intensify what I am feeling? Breathe into it. It's very common for these stories we tell ourselves to be causing or exacerbating our feelings. I often tell myself I should have done something, and this causes a lot of frustration, for example. It can often exacerbate some confusion and some anger. Good. Just notice it. Again, we naturally tell ourselves these stories to make sense of our experience, and just noticing these things, this interaction between our stories and our feelings is already soothing. We're already making lots of space, and we're already taking a lot of responsibility for our own experience. This ends up being crucial when it comes time to communicate our experience. If it did not feel worse or intensify what you were feeling, that's important information too. It may be something that we can communicate. Now, noticing this story that's sticking with us, we now know whether or not it's interacting with our own felt experience. I'm going to repeat it, but this time imagine saying it to the other person in this conversation. Would saying this out loud feel worse? Would it be fair to say it? Breathe into that. Letting it be there. This can bring up a lot for us. Anything else is coming up that you need to jot down, please feel free. Just a couple more breaths. Notice if it felt worse to imagine saying this to the other person. This is very helpful. We want to avoid saying things that make us feel worse. We want to avoid saying things that would seem unfair. And now we get to simply hold all of this in our experience. We know that all of this is coming up for us. So we don't have to say it. We get to choose our response. One more breath. Now, this is important. We get to work with this stuff. Again, we're not rejecting the anger that we might feel. We're not rejecting these stories, even if we know now that they are unfair. We're going to work with them because they're going to help us choose our response. In our feelings and in our stories are clues to what we want and need from this situation. Remember, those wants and needs that come into contact are the cause of conflict. They are causing the discomfort. That's where we need to get to find our win-win, to move through this together. And our feelings and our stories are clues. Now, I want to go through this in some detail with you guys, making it a little more tangible for us. So we're going to look at our feelings first. All right. We're going to list what the needs might be connected to those feelings. Now, some of them are fairly straightforward. If, for example, I'm feeling confused, what might I need in this situation? Pop your ideas into the chat. Speak up if you feel comfortable. I see reassurance. I see affirmation. I see an answer to a question. These are all fantastic. Affirmation, reassurance, clarity. Clarity. Answers. Yeah. We need information. In the case of affirmation or reassurance, the information we need is that somebody does care what we have to say, or is listening, or does understand. In the case of clarity or answers, we need information about this conflict. We need to know something that we don't know when we're feeling confused. Good. So then if we are feeling hurt, this one might be a little less straightforward. There's a few different things that we might need if we're feeling hurt. Pop your ideas into the chat. Support. Yes. Yes, I love that. I love that. So many of us feel hurt and just need to know that we're not hurt alone. So we could use that support. A hug. Yeah. A hug is a great example of physical nurturing that so many of us need and can really help us in an uncomfortable situation with uncertainty, with whatever hurt we happen to be feeling. Support, physical nurturing. Yeah. Perspective. Interesting. I like that, and I wonder if you might be willing to elaborate on what you mean by perspective. If you feel more comfortable typing it in the chat, that works as well. I see cool down. So you might be experiencing some heat, some literal physical heat, yeah? When you're in an uncomfortable conversation. A lot of us do. It's very common. Our hands get sweaty, face gets sweaty, might even feel some heat. A lot of us can feel some heat and maybe even see some red starting to come up our neck and into our face. So we might need to cool down. I like that a lot.
For perspective, I was thinking kind of like this exercise a little bit. Sometimes when you think about a hurtful situation or what someone might have like said to you, I think you can hurt yourself by think like these stories, like, oh, like they don't care about me and they never cared about me and they're just like, I'm worthless, yada yada. I think that can be, I guess I was thinking that adds to the hurt. So an exercise like this is helpful.
And don't care, they always do this, which is a story, as you mentioned, and that can cause hurt. You can hurt yourself, like you said. Thank you for clarifying that and for giving us a little bit of insight into that, because the perspective, it sounds like what you are saying is that the perspective you find valuable is whether or not this story you're telling yourself is true. Yeah. And that can be the game-changing perspective. Is it true? Right? And so then we come back to one of these basic needs of reassurance. If I'm telling myself this person doesn't care, and that's why they're doing what they're doing or saying what they're saying, I don't feel assured. I feel, and I'm telling myself that story, which is causing hurt or exacerbating the hurt. And so I need to be reassured that they do indeed care. Whether that's verbally or with a hug, can take many forms. Thank you for sharing that. Good, so we got into a story here as well, and what that might be revealing about our needs, right? So this story, we need perspective or clarity. So the idea, as you can see, is that we can use this now illuminated information about what we're actually feeling and all of these stories we're telling ourselves about our feelings and about the situation to understand what we actually want and need underneath it. If I'm hurt, I might need some support, some physical nurturing. If I'm telling myself these stories that are hurting me, I might need some perspective. I might need to be reassured that the story isn't true. And this is what to communicate. Our feelings and our needs are what we want to bring to the conversation. We've sat now with the discomfort long enough that we have some idea, at least a prototype for what to communicate, right? Our needs and our feelings. Now, notice that we've also separated the needs and the stories, which is convenient, and almost always the thoughts and the stories aren't what we communicate. Sometimes you might want some clarity, like, hey, I'm telling myself such and such thing. I just need you, I need to hear you say that that's not true. like you said, perspective or clarity can be really useful. Starting out with this practice, since it's so unfamiliar to us, it's easier to just focus on the feelings and the needs around that. I am feeling nervous around blank decision, and I need some soothing. I'd like you to hold my hand while we continue this conversation. Or I would like the reassurance that we are trying to solve this together. Or I would like a break. Maybe I need the physical nurturance I need is a walk around the block. Some more time to breathe, right? So when we don't take this time is when conflict goes off the rails and spins out of control. That's where it turns into those big explosive arguments that we think of as conflict typically. And that's because we are running with these stories about the other person not caring or something being unfair or that I'm doing something wrong. We're running with that, we're communicating those things, or we're operating assuming that those stories are true. So when we get to fill out this chart, for example, or do this exercise internally, we get to work with this information instead of letting all of this experience work us and cause our reactions. We get to choose our response. So we took a few minutes here, more than a few minutes, to sit with the discomfort and sort of illuminate all of these aspects of our experience. And when we practice this, it becomes much more natural. It can become automatic, actually. And it feels very weird. It feels like this exercise might even cause some discomfort of its own, but we are naturally inclined toward harmony, remember? So when we are practicing something that arrives at harmony or has a better chance at arriving there, it starts to come naturally to us. All of this processing, filling out all three of these columns internally or even on paper, can be done in a matter of seconds once you've practiced it just a few times. Our hearts and our minds and our nervous systems want to be doing this. They want to be making space for this experience and sharing it with the other and learning about the other's experience as well. So all of this comes very naturally to us. We just have to practice it, and we just have to sit with the discomfort long enough to do so. So I want to, before we wrap up, and I say thanks for being here, etc., I want to take a few minutes and just talk about how that experience went for us as much as you guys are willing to share. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if you want to type some things into the chat, you can throw in things that came up on paper for you, other thoughts and ideas and feelings that came up as we were moving through it together, even if it was just kind of difficult, or if there's anything that you would like to explore a little bit more, you want some clarity on some things, pop it into the chat, speak up if you feel comfortable. We've got a few minutes to dig in a little bit. I see in the chat, I like how the exercise kind of forces you to look at what your own needs are. Followed up by, they're so easy to ignore sometimes. Yeah. Thank you for that. The idea is that to be good at communicating, we need to know what to communicate. And we tend to stay at the level of the stories because that's what's most present. Or we tend to fall into one of the patterns we discussed, which ignores our needs. Like it's so easy to do, as you mentioned. Thank you for that. Sydney, I feel more inclined to look into the bigger picture of conflicts. I appreciate that. If you are willing to elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the bigger picture, I would love to hear what you have to say on that. You can type it into the chat if that's more comfortable for you. Thank you, Sydney. I see Hani, focusing on breathing was a good exercise and made me focus on my own feelings. Yeah, very similar to forcing us to look at our own needs. Yeah, our feelings, our needs, our own felt experience is somehow so foreign to us so much of the time. And one of the foundational principles of my work and this practice is bringing that into our awareness. We're knowing the place from which we are communicating, my needs, my feelings, what I want out of this. Justin, I got a problem of overthinking, getting hung up on imaginary issues. Asking myself about these feelings and my thoughts is very grounding, especially with the breathing. Yeah. It sounds, Justin, like you've got a really overactive mind like I do. And speaking of how much we like stories, it can be very seductive, that rabbit hole of what you called imaginary issues where the stories we're telling ourselves get in the way of accessing the real wants and needs. And it looks like I have a cat here who needs some attention. There's Junie. She needs some love. She's not afraid to ask for it. We can all learn something from her. Thank you for sharing that, Justin. There's a lot that's always going on in our minds. I mean, this problem-solving machine has evolved the way it has for a reason, and we're very much able to adapt and problem solve on the fly. And when we're dealing with wants and needs not getting met and the discomfort of that, it can be hard to ground into those things and really communicate on behalf of them. So I feel you, and I appreciate you sharing that. Right on. Anything else before I wrap up? All right. I hope we got some value out of this. I hope we're all feeling a bit more grounded in our bodies and in our breath. We've all made a little bit of space for our feelings and our needs and some of the stuff we tell ourselves about them. We can use this exact exercise, even just these 3 columns, to examine some of those things that we've been ruminating on. It's helpful to flesh out our whole experience in that context. I think it's a really useful tool to prepare for a conversation we know we need to have, to know what we're bringing into that interaction, and to know that these stories and other ones might come up, and that those might not be the things we want to communicate once we're in that conversation. To have this paper with us as a recommendation I would definitely make. So thank you guys for joining us. I got to share some of my ideas with you and share this really useful practice. We talked about how conflict really is common and how it can be sneaky uncomfortable, because all it really is differing wants and needs and ideas. We talked about how common this is and how common it is to avoid or rush through that discomfort. We also talked about the problems that that causes, summed up by keeps us from really knowing what we want and need. We talked about in a little bit of detail the problems that can create, and we got to reframe those things as not a problem. Then we started retraining our nervous systems to be able to handle that discomfort. So we got to move through some discomfort together and explore it. And I really appreciate the participation, the openness, and I hope that you guys take this with you. And I'm gonna stop the recording now, but I'll you guys can stick around and share anything else you want to.